Today on the podcast, guys, I'm talking about a psychopath that nurses a writer back to health while encouraging him to write another book. It sounds incredibly uplifting, but it's not. It is Stephen King's Misery, so hang around and listen to a novel review. Hello and welcome to the Literature Podcast, a novel review. My name is Seamus, your host, and together we will discuss, dissect, and explore the wonderful world of literature. And the wonderful world of literature is a vast and dense jungle. So let's start making our way through, one book at a time. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of a novel review. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Seamus, I'm the host. And this is a book podcast. I do what it says on the tin. Each week I speak about a different book, and today is no different. I'm speaking about Misery by Stephen King. If this is your first time joining, thank you so much for coming. I really do appreciate it. Thanks for clicking on and trusting me for the next 20 minutes to deliver something that should be hopefully enjoyable. If you're a returning customer, thank you so much for coming back. I really do appreciate that as well. I love it. It's fantastic. So every week I do a mantelpiece moment, just something to highlight from the week past. And this past week, well, if you watched the last episode, you'd know I'm in Australia. I normally live in the UK, but I've returned to Australia for a friend's wedding. And when I initially moved to London, I had to leave a lot of books behind because books are incredibly heavy and you can't take them all with you. Now, it's kind of like the story gets a bit convoluted here. On the podcast, I've started doing fantasy books. I try to do one fantasy book a month, normally a series. So this year I've done The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. That was 3 episodes over 3 months. I did the Harry Potter series again, 7 books over 7 months. I'm currently doing His Dark Materials, and I've got the next 2 fantasy trilogies lined up. But I knew in my book section back in Australia that I had these 5 fantasy books that I've always wanted to read. I bought the books initially when I was like 19, so 2012, 2013 era. And I bought these 5 fantasy books and I'd always wanted to read them. I don't know why, but I've always just had this idea in my head that they're going to be really comforting and really nice. And I was like, oh, brilliant. I'm going back to Australia. I'm going to pick up those 5 books and they're going to comprise, 5 months of fantasy reading for me. I picked them up, looked at them, got really excited and was like, it's finally going to be time. It just looks cozy. I just had this feeling about it, and my feeling about it could not have been more wrong. I decided to, and I guess this is the mantelpiece moment. It's about how do you separate art from the artist. I decided to look into the author. The author is David Eddings, and the series is the Belgariad. I decided to look into the author to see if, people really like these books, if people didn't like the books, purely for the reason that if everyone said these books sucked, probably wouldn't do a podcast on them because I probably wouldn't enjoy reading them enough to stick it out for 5 books as well. And it turns out that David Eddings and his wife were abhorrent human beings. They did some incredibly terrible, nasty, shocking things to very, very innocent people. They took an immense amount of advantage over people, and it pretty much just turned me off completely. Wanting to read these books completely, and it really kind of annoyed me because I was like, I've been excited for these for so long. I've had them in my mind as these really cozy books. And I bought the books brand new as well, so it's kind of like I funded that. And I guess the conversation is now, how do you separate, or can you separate art from the artist? Is there a way? I don't think there's a perfect answer for this because I think people will always have opinions one way or the other. I think there is such a stark duality in this situation because David Eddings and his wife have both passed away. They've both died. So they're getting no, benefit from the purchase of the books, and actually the profits from the purchases of the books are now feeding into a charity. So there is kind of that nice aspect of, obviously I bought these and I didn't understand at the time what I was purchasing and how I was potentially funding someone, a terrible person. But now that money is actually feeding into a charity, and I guess it's just such a tough duality because it's like, buy the books to then fund a charity, but you're also keeping his name alive and furthering, his legacy in a way that people don't understand. People like me that when they bought the books, they just saw good fantasy books. And I mean, you can't blame people for that because a lot of people wouldn't look into authors and the backstories of authors. A lot of people will just pick up books and read the books because they want to. So it's kind of like, yeah, look, if we can, fund a charity off this, that's great. But obviously if you look into it, you're like, oh, that sucks. I didn't actually want to keep that person's name going. So I guess this was just an opportunity for me to rant a little bit because it frustrated me a lot because, yeah, I'd been so excited for it, but he was a terrible person, and now I'm probably not going to read them. I might wait 10, 20 years and hopefully I lose my mind a bit, forget a few things, and then read him fresh, forgetting that he was a terrible person. But it's just, yeah, it's that really tough question of how do you separate, or can you separate art from an artist? Is there a way? Is this actually a really good way where the author of the book is dead and now money, the profits from the book are actually being funneled into a charity? So I don't know. Let me know your thoughts if you've got any, strong opinions on this. That would be really nice as well. That being said, I'm probably not going to read these books. Probably won't chuck them out, to be fair, because I have bought them brand new and there's nothing technically wrong with them besides the name on the front cover. Might get to them one day, I don't know, but they're definitely going to the bottom of the reading pile. So that was my mantelpiece moment this week, just a little frustration in I guess, meeting your heroes or learning something about your heroes that, not that he was particularly a hero in the first place, but just learning something about someone that just sort of turns you off them a bit and you're like, did you really have to do that? Housekeeping, as always, if you would like to like and subscribe, I would really appreciate it. Click the duck in the corner, hit 5-star reviews. I really do appreciate it. It really makes my day. And it helps other people find the show, which is really cool. So yeah, thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for listening. I think I better get on with the episode. Okay, on to the main body of the episode, Misery by Stephen King. If you take a look back through my little catalogue of episodes, you will see, I think it was like 3 or 4 episodes ago, I actually did another Stephen King book, which was Carrie, the first book he ever wrote. And I really try not to do that both on the pod and as a reader. I try not to read authors too close together, primarily because, well, if I find an author I like, I often find that, if they've passed away, you've got a very, minute selection of written works that you've got to then get through for the rest of my life. And I'm still, I think, young enough that I can take my time with them. Like the first time I read Hemingway, I was like, oh, this is incredible. I like this author. Didn't read another one of his books for a few years because I was like, he's dead. He's got, quite a few good books, but not that many that you can read them back to back to back to back and be like, wow, that was incredible. Because also in that instance, you'd probably end up hating them as a writer as well because you need a break. But yeah, I just try to avoid authors that I've really loved because they've often got a very small selection of work that's really, really good. Stephen King, on the other hand, is still very much alive, very much producing books, and he has written already a lot of books. So a friend recommended this, Misery. He said it was an incredible book, and I thought, why not? Like, I enjoyed Carrie. Let's jump into it. Let's, jump straight into another book. I think I'll do a brief overview just to catch you all up on what it's about in case you don't know. Basically, it is about an author, Paul, who writes these kind of books that he doesn't particularly love called these misery books. They're kind of like what I envision them, kind of like Pride and Prejudice, Bridgerton kind of books, like these old sort of landed gentry English, like high society people living their high society lives, basically. And he thinks they're not particularly that good. He's kind of grown sick of Misery Chastain, the main character, and he's actually killed her off. Paul then gets in a very, very bad car accident, and he is rescued by a woman who was a nurse, and she takes him back to his house and starts to nurse him back to health. He is bedridden, he's broken his legs, and he can't escape. And at first, he's kind of like not really certain what's going on, and then as we get into the story more and more, we realize that she is a psychopath, and she's not too happy because she is Paul's favorite. She's a #1 fan, she says, and she's a huge fan of his work. And then she realizes that in his most recent book, he's actually killed off Misery Chastain. And she gets very, very upset about this and basically compels him to write another book through means of torture. That probably made it sound a lot more convoluted than it really is. It's a really sort of fast-paced page turner. It's an incredible amount of fun. It's incredibly frightening. There's some horrifying scenes in this, but basically it's a writer that's trapped in a house with his #1 fan, in inverted commas, as she pushes him to write a new book because she's not happy that her favorite fictional character has been killed off. So it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. I'm already like obsessed with Stephen King as a writer. Where should I even start this? Okay, I know where to start. When I did the episode on Carrie, I actually listened to that book, and I thought, as I was listening to it, I wasn't as engaged as I thought I would. I was really enjoying the story, but I was sort of like lacking something, and I think it's just going to be a better book written. And you could probably sit there and go, well, that's going to be a lot of books. Like, a lot of books are going to be better written than audiobooks, and I'd mostly agree on that. but there are definitely some great books where there's great audio productions. Dracula's one where they get different voice actors. It's epistolary, so there's lots of letters, and they get voice actors to voice all the different characters in the book. It's an incredible experience. I'd really recommend listening to that. That's just one example of where, audiobooks are almost better than the books in that instance. So in this one, I was like really interested to see whether my experience would be much different from the audio experience, and I gotta say it was completely different. It was so much better. This is a book that and I think he's just going to be all his books. I think he's just a writer that really utilizes so many different things in the book that you just miss in the audio. So like there'll be a conversation going on between two people, and then suddenly there'll be one line threaded in there that's an internal thought of a main character. And of course, when you're doing that as an audiobook, it's incredibly hard to portray that and get that across in a way that doesn't feel fractured and clunky, because you need to kind of take a pause in the text, put on a different style of voice, because in the text it's just italicized, put on a different style of voice, and then jump back into the conversation. And it can be really fracturing for that reason, and it can slow down the paciness of the book, because it is an incredibly pacey book. And so I think it's just things like that you lose in an audiobook that just make it not as an enjoyable as experience as it could. There's also other elements, like because he's confined to bed, he's now writing on a typewriter. And so when he starts writing this story, when Paul starts writing this story, the text of the story is in a typewriter text. But there's lots of cool things, like the typewriter's missing an end, so he has to hand draw in the ends. And in the text, the ends are in a different font to the typewriter text. It's just little details like that they don't necessarily add anything to the story per se, and you don't necessarily miss them when you're listening to it as an audiobook. But it's just one of those elements that sort of brings you into the story that little bit more and makes it a bit more fun, which is kind of what Stephen King's all about. I'm sort of read a bit about him now, and I think a few people would agree with this. I hope I don't upset anybody by saying this, but he's not a Tolstoy. He's not a really gifted writer in that he's a Tolstoy. He's not trying to show off. He's just a really good storyteller, and he can turn a page like no one else. I've always said the markings of like a great, like top of the line book is a good story and a good writer. But some people, they're really good storytellers, and I think he's a fine writer. There's nothing particularly wrong with his writing style, but he's not a Tolstoy. He's not a Tolkien. He's not a Hemingway, but he's still an incredible writer. And he's an incredible storyteller. And that's a really important aspect, because that's what keeps you going. That's really what keeps you going. It's almost more important to have a really interesting story than it is to be a good writer, because if you're a good writer telling a really boring story, people are going to be disengaged. But if you're an average writer or a decent writer, as Stephen King is, and you're telling a really good story, people are going to be engaged. I mean, he's a best-selling author. He's written so many books, and people keep buying them. Why? Because he's a fantastic writer, because he's a fantastic storyteller, because the stories are engaging and they keep you wanting to read. A really good example of this is the fact that it is really a story between two people taking place in a bedroom. Paul is confined to bed. He's got broken legs. He can't move. I think he had a broken hip as well. So he can't move. He's stuck to bed for a lot of this story. And we only really get interaction with him when Annie comes into the bedroom. And so this entire story, I mean, it's nearly 400 pages of story, takes place pretty much in a bedroom. But there's something so rich about this story. There's something that really keeps you going. And it's sort of the suspense of, is he going to be able to escape? Is he going to finish writing this book and then be killed by this woman who's a psychopath? Is this woman who is a psychopath just going to suddenly snap and kill him? How is she going to torture him next? What is going to happen? When the policeman inevitably shows up looking for him, is he going to cry out, risk getting killed by Annie? Is he going to risk his own humanity that way? Is he going to risk his mortality that way? How is it, what is going to happen? All these questions arise through the story, and it's just incredibly rich and invigorating and so much fun to read, because these are all very relevant questions. He's confined to bed. What's actually going to happen? I think one of the advantages to a story like this, with only having really two main characters, is that you can actually develop those characters really, really well, so that they both feel really, realistic and really engaged. Paul feels like a writer who's struggled, who's then sort of tried to turn away from this writing style that he sort of embellished in and made a lot of money from, but now he wants to turn to something a bit more serious. But then you've got Annie, who's a bit more engaged and wants those trashy kind of stories a lot more, but she's a psychopath as well. And it's just kind of like, because you've only got two characters, you can really sort of build them out as really rich characters in a way that would be a lot more difficult if you've got more characters, of course. And so because of that, you just get these really I feel authentic conversations going on, really authentic interactions going on. And also because she's a psychopath, you just don't know what she's going to do next and how she's going to react. But nothing feels, I guess, outrageous in terms of how she reacts to things. It's kind of like you're in suspense of what's going to happen. But when it finally happens, you're like, yeah, of course that happened. Of course she did that. Of course she fed him the mop water. Of course well, I won't actually say that because that's a huge spoiler. But of course she did these things. And it's kind of like you're just constantly hustling to the next part of the story. Another thing he really does to keep this story fresh is the chapters are quite short as well, which is a really, I think, smart thing to do because essentially it is a story of a guy in a room. And so the chapters could become incredibly long because there's nothing to really do and there's no reason to stop writing. But keeping these chapters really short and always ending on a little cliffhanger or a little question, it really keeps you engaged in going to the next chapter. And because they're really short chapters, you're always in the mind of, you know what, I can read one more chapter. I can read a couple more pages to find out what happens next. And then something else happens. And it just keeps building like that in this really intelligent way. Because like I said, he's not a fantastic wordsmith in that he's a Tolstoy, but he's employing so many other elements of the literature genre into his stories that it really keeps you engaged on a different kind of level, which is really masterful. And I really, really enjoy it because it makes the reading experience so much more fresh and fun. And sometimes you just want to read a book that isn't difficult. You just want to read a book that's the pages are turning quickly, the story's developing fast, and you get there and you've read 100 pages, 200 pages, 300 pages, and you're like, I've been in this bedroom for 300 pages and nothing's really happened, but I've been engaged the entire time. And that's kind of like the true beauty of this book, the true skill of this book is just keeping you engaged. And I mean, I really, really enjoyed it. It's an absolutely horrifying thriller because Paul is just tortured, but then he also starts to really love this story that he's tortured into writing. Annie Wilkes is this psychopath is just chaotic but wonderful as well. Like you really enjoy her because you don't know what she's going to do and you don't really know how unhinged she is and what's actually going to happen and what she's going to do. And the story just evolves with this pace. I mean, I think I've said that so many times already today. So I really, really enjoyed it. Definitely, like we're coming up to the Christmas period. So, you know, if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, it's coming up to summer. If you're in the Northern Hemisphere, it's coming up to winter. I definitely recommend for either because it's either a beach read or I wouldn't say a cozy read because it is quite a dark, thrilling story. But it's a kind of book that you can smash through in a couple of days and absolutely enjoy and have had a lot of fun reading. So I'm definitely recommending that for the holiday period. Stephen King's Misery. Check it out. It was absolutely thrilling. I would rate this for pure entertainment enjoyment. I'm going to rate this a 4.4 out of 5. Okay, so what was I reading this week? This week I picked up this little number, Claire Keegan, So Late in the Day. If you're a long-time listener of this podcast, pretty much a year ago, I read Small Things Like These and instantly fell in love with it. I stand by that. I think it's one of the best books of the 21st century. I will die on that hill, so don't even bother arguing. She's an example of someone that also is an incredibly good writer in a different way to Stephen King. She is phenomenal. I absolutely love her. This particular book is a bit shorter. It's about 40 pages. I mean, all her books are pretty short, let's be honest. But this one's just that tiny bit shorter. It's about 40 pages. You can read it in pretty much like 30 minutes. And it's all about this guy reminiscing on this relationship he had and sort of how close he got to securing, I guess, securing is probably a bad word, but so close to getting married and so close to, I guess, securing in that sense of like this next stage in your life, if you want to look at it like that. And it's this reminiscent just in one afternoon of what that, you know, was and how we got to that stage and how we got to where we are now. And it's incredibly deep and dark and depressing. And, you know, there's like a couple horrifying scenes. The scene with the mother, just like she orchestrates so well in just a couple of lines. She just, you know, completely does this thing where it's just like, whoa, that was incredibly dark. And we just moved along so quickly. But like, you've just done it in 2 lines and you've captured something so vivid and visceral. And you've just done it, in a couple of words in 2 lines. And she's definitely a fantastic author. If you've never read anything by Claire Keegan, honestly, get on it because she's fantastic. Small Things Like These was absolutely phenomenal. I did an episode on that, so go check that out. But So Late in the Day by Claire Keegan, fantastic little book. Definitely one to put on the list to read because, again, you can read it in 30 minutes. So, you know, why not? If you have listened this far, thank you so much for listening. I really do appreciate it. Please feel free to subscribe. It is a free podcast, so don't subscribe if you don't want to. If you've just wanted to listen to this episode, I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to head to the website and support the pod and otherwise. But as always, just thank you for your attention. I really do appreciate it. So I think it's time to end this episode. And today I'm going to read chapter 1 from Misery, because this is kind of like it's tiny mystery that takes place. And it took me a long time to figure out what was actually being said. And, it's 4 lines long, so don't think I'm reading a long chapter. And it reads, Umber one, yearn umber one, fayen, these sounds, even in the haze.